Welcome back to The Long Way Home. I'm your host, Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're going to be talking about something that kind of near and dear to my heart, and that's getting old. And I say that because I feel like I'm getting old, and I know I'm not really old. I'm only 38. I just had my 38th birthday a couple weeks ago, and there was a time in my life where 38 seemed really, really old, when I was a teenager. I remember being, 13, 14 years old, and I thought my parents were just ancient. And my grandparents, they were just, archaic. I thought they were old as dirt, It just to me it didn't seem feasible that I would ever be in my 30s or 40s or, God forbid getting up into my 50s or 60s. So when I think back on that and I think about, what it means to get old, and I think of it in relation to my kids because I've got a different perspective on it now. 20 years ago, before I had any children, and I was 18, and I was like, I can't imagine being old. I can't imagine being as old as my parents, and it's such a weird dynamic now to kind of look back and look at my kids specifically and realize what they are thinking compared to like what I was thinking back then. I'm one of the I want to think I want to try and say I'm like one of the rare parents that I can put myself in my kids' shoes pretty easily because I remember what it was like to be a teenager. And my mom told me all the time in when I was in high school, I hated school completely. But she would tell me constantly that high school is the best 4 years of your life and you should go out and enjoy it. It wasn't always possible for me to do fun things in high school, but it certainly wasn't the best 4 years of my life. And I look back on that now, and I'm like, well, maybe if you peaked in high school, if you were the star quarterback and that was like the best thing you ever did, maybe the high school was the best 4 years of your life. But for me, high school was okay. I switched schools in the middle of, so I did my freshman and sophomore year in high school in one school, and then I did my junior and senior years in a different school. So I had to meet all new people. I didn't really have a chance to make a lot of friends in the new school before I graduated. I don't even, they probably had a class reunion at some point that I was never invited to or just completely missed. But it seemed to me that getting old would never be a thing. And now I look at it in a different light because now I'm 38 and I'm looking down the road and what is old? And we think of it in light sometimes of politics, especially in this year because the two people running for president are older than 75. They're almost one is in his 80s, the other one's in his late 70s, and it's like, okay, is that old? What makes somebody old? Is it is it I try to think of it like a state of being, a mental state, what equals old is you're as old as you feel. For me, especially as a teenager, now looking back on it especially, I was a lot older mentally than my peers. And I always got along better with the teachers. I always got along better with the adults than I did with the kids my own age. I always thought the kids my own age were immature, and I just didn't want to hang out with most of them. And so I always felt like I was older. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with somebody when they get older. If you're in your 50s, 60s, 70s, and you don't feel it, you still feel spry, or, you don't have to, you're not going to be running marathons or anything necessarily, but like it's all a mental state. My wife's grandmother, who one of my favorite people in the world, she passed away in 2016, but she was always one of those people that just seemed a lot younger than she actually was. And I'll never forget, that was one thing that she always would catch me off guard with the things she would say, and it was stuff that I just never expected to hear out of what I considered an old person. For instance, we were there for Christmas one year, and I said something about, "Oh man, we have so many kids. Why do we have so many kids?" to my wife, and her grandma was standing there, and I didn't see her, but she piped up and she goes, "Because you enjoy having sex." I was like, wow, I never would have expected to hear that from you. And conversely, my own grandmother, who passed away last year, she was old and you could tell it. She had an older look on life. She looked down on the younger generations. It's one of those things where you look at old versus young, and you question, like, what does that actually mean? Because when you're 13, 14, 30 seems old. That's a saying, I remember when 30 was old. Well, 30, 35, that seemed like just really old. It seemed ancient to me. And I think to most teenagers, it seems that way. And then you get there and it's like, okay, well, I'm in my mid 30s now. I guess 30 is not really old anymore. So what is old? Well, maybe it's 60. But then when you hit 60, you don't want to say you're old then. And it's just kind of a never-ending cycle. And so realistically, like from my perspective, it's age is a number and a mental state is feeling old is a mental state. And what I mean by that is, like, if you are the kind of person that is up to date on things, is keeping up, you don't look down on the younger generations as like out of it's you have to be looking at what the world around you is doing, moving with the world around you, and you don't have to always accept everything. You don't have to. For instance, I don't like TikTok. It's a younger generation thing. The short form content, I'm just not a big fan of. There's times that, like, I've seen some short form videos that were kind of cool, but for the most part, I just don't like the short form content that's out there now. But that doesn't mean that it's bad. And I'm not going to like go on a tirade against it. I've done that before where I've gotten angry about it. I've been, frustrated when, especially when I was trying to build a YouTube channel. And it's not something you can really do. You gotta learn to accept the world around you for what it is. And that doesn't necessarily mean liking it. I'm not a fan of some of the things that are going on nowadays, but you have to be able to accept it and say, yeah, you know what, this is happening, and adjust to the world in the way that it is. And that's where I think that aging, you know, aging, getting older, I tell my kids all the time, my oldest is going to be 18, which makes me feel extremely old. But, she's going to be 18 this fall. And I'm like, look, right now it seems like the world is like everything sucks, right? You're waiting on things, you're waiting to turn 18, you're waiting to graduate high school, you're waiting for this, waiting for that. But 20 years from now, the next 20 years will go by before you even realize it. It'll be a blink of an eye. And you'll look back and you'll say, wow, the stuff that I thought mattered when I was 18 really wasn't that big of a deal. She's getting ready to start her senior year of high school. And I keep reminding her, because I didn't have these reminders when I was her age, that time is going to fly by in the blink of an eye. I constantly am reminding her, this is your last summer at home, because she's joining the military, so she's going to be going off to basic training. I'm like, this is your last summer at home, your last summer to spend with your sister and your brother and your parents, and go swimming and do all the stuff, the kids stuff, before you get out into the world, because there's a big change that happens at that point when you go from graduating high school out into the world, whether you go to college or get a job, go straight into the workforce somewhere, or join the military, wherever you go, there's a demarcation point. And I think when you're there, you don't think about it. You don't realize that demarcation point is a thing until well after the fact. And taking a moment to step back and appreciate those demarcation points in life, I think, is something that people don't take enough time to do. Whether it's graduating high school, there's demarcation points throughout your school age. When you go from elementary, at least in the United States, the way that our school system works, when you go from elementary to middle school, and you go from middle school to high school, those are demarcation points. You hit your teen years, you go from 12 to 13 years old, that's a demarcation. 20, when you hit 21 years old, because you can legally drink, that's another one. And those points of demarcation, you end up getting less and less of them as you grow older. For a lot of people, once you hit 21 and you can drink, well, now kind of the whole world's open. There's not really another point to really look for until retirement age for a lot of people. I've thought about it along the way, at least in the political sense. I'm weird like that. Okay, I thought when I turned 25, I'm like, wow, I'm old enough now to run for the U.S. House. And when I'm 30, like I can run for the Senate. Now I can run for president. I'm 35, I'm 38 now. Like, but there's not really another point like that if you really think about it. Maybe graduating college, if you do a 4-year college and you graduate at 22 or 23, maybe that's a point of demarcation. But there's not really other points out there that you can really point to as ages. You can look at life stages. So you graduate high school, you graduate college, you get married, having kids, or whatever path life takes you down. There's those life stages that you're in, but those aren't dependent necessarily on age. Even though the average person might wait until their mid to late 20s to get married, and late 20s to early 30s just to have their first kid, to settle down, to buy a house, like those kind of things. But those are activities that aren't age dependent necessarily. So when it comes to like just paying attention to your age and what that means and what growing older means, because by the time you hit retirement, like you're retired. You're you're expected to not do a whole lot, and you've probably used most of your body up to where you're not as agile as you used to be. You're not as fit. You're not, that your health is going downhill, because once you get into your 60s and 70s, it's downhill from there for the most part, at least for now. And unless medical science can find a way to advance past that at some point, but it's a question of what are you waiting for? And I guess that kind of get drives at the point of where I'm going with all of this is age is a number, getting older is a number, but do you ever actually get old? And do you really want to wait for that point? You know, you should really be paying attention to today and what today brings you, as opposed to looking at what age is old, as opposed to if you're a teenager, if you're out there, if you're 13, 14, you're listening to this podcast, first of all, hey, awesome, good job. You've made it 12 or 13 minutes into a rambling old man online. But it, if you are that age and you're looking at like 30 years old, uh, maybe refocus. Maybe think of, well, maybe I don't need to focus on what's old. Maybe I should focus more on living in the moment and what it means to not necessarily be old, but to have these experiences and grow, and because being old isn't a bad thing. I thought that at one stage of my life, I thought that being old was bad, and it meant that you were getting closer to the end of your life. And the truth of the matter is, well, yes, the older you get, the closer you will get to the end of your life, because we all die at some point. You have more experience under your belt. You have more things that you've done. You have more life and things to share and things to talk about, more lived experiences. Like there's all of these things that you've done, and to me that's the value, and that's why I don't fear getting old. I don't think about getting old in a negative sense anymore. I don't look at an age and say, well, that's where I'm going to be old. Because I've realized that I'm not. Some people will consider me old no matter what. There's people now that will consider me old. There's people that still tell me that I'm a kid. You know, I've run into that in the past with people that I worked with, where they were like, "Oh, you're still young." Like, you're 20 years older than me. And you're saying you're acting like I'm some kind of a kid. Where's that line where I can say, "Look, I'm the old man now. I know I have the experience now." And so I think that kind of goes for everybody. Is it serves you best in life to focus on not what is old and what does it mean to get old, but what everyday life means and what those experiences mean, and what experiences will you be able to say that you have had at different ages in life, at different stages. When you're 30, 40, 50, 60 years old, what will you be able to say you've done? For me, I can look back on my life right now and I can say, I served my country. I went to Iraq. I've seen different parts of the world. I have traveled the country. I've written books. I've done all these different things. There's still a lot left to do. But it's a matter of instead of looking at it and saying, well, that's old, looking and saying, what will I have accomplished by that time? So this is one of the ones that I kind of wanted to just talk about because I thought to myself, I used to think 30 was old. And I've thought in the past, especially as I've gotten older, like what is considered old anymore? And when do I hit that point? And so I wanted to kind of just ramble and talk for a few minutes about aging and getting older and all that kind of stuff. I've got a bunch of other episodes. I'm planning on recording a couple, um, talking about military service and talking about maybe some sports stuff and early memories and that kind of stuff. So stay tuned if that's something that you want to. If it sounds interesting to you, if you've listened to the other, I've got this is an entire podcast, So if you've listened to the other episodes, this is on YouTube. It's on Patreon. I'm releasing the episodes on Patreon first, and then they're coming out on YouTube later. So those are the thing. I've got Legends and Tales series on YouTube. That's going to be. I'm working on another episode for that. I've been talking about that for a while, so I don't know exactly. It's supposed to come out sometime around middle of June, but I've got a lot going on, so maybe I'll talk about that in another episode as well. But that's all I've got for this one. I just really wanted to talk about aging and whether 30 was really old and what being old actually means. So I want to thank you all for listening. Everybody have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next one.